Welcome to the Battle of Homestead Foundation's program tonight. We're really excited to have a good friend and well-known to our historians and archivists in the city, and it's really notable that Zach Brodt has written a book that is going to be fun to talk about. And I'm very pleased that he's consented to come and talk about his book with us tonight. Zach, as most of you know, is university archivist and records manager at the University of Pittsburgh. Many of our members in the Battle of Homestead Foundation have consulted with Zach and discussed their archives with him, and Zach has facilitated greatly the possession of the archives at Pitt and the archive work that our interns that we've hired to work on some of the archives of our members. Zach has been their mentor and helped them make sure that it's following all the procedures. My name's John Hare. I'm honored to be the president of our board of directors. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Battle of Homestead Foundation, I just want to read to you a little bit about who we are and what we do. Our mission, we're inspired by the dramatic labor conflict of 1892, Battle of Homestead. We promote a people's history, empowering today's workforce, and build strategies for the future of work. Our values that we hope to emphasize are the dignity of work, labor's rich heritage and its pivotal place in our society, community engagement through programs and partnerships, skills development and a prepared workforce for the future, and human rights within a robust democracy, which is more and more a problem as our current history is telling us. Our vision is we will celebrate working class culture, preserve labor's rich heritage, and shape the future of work. That's a big future to envision, an ambitious one. And a lot of us have gotten gray hair pushing that mission for the last 30 or so years, but one that's worth doing, heartfelt, and helps us understand where we are today by looking where we were, where our ancestors were, where the people that came before us, and prepared and developed the society that we live in today. Zach's book, From the Steel City to the White City, talks about only 1 year after the Battle of Homestead, 1893. I'm anxious to hear this discussion. I know that there will be lots of discussion about alternating power and the Ferris wheel and Pittsburgh's contributions. I've been thinking, if I had been a worker at Homestead and experienced the Battle of Homestead, and at this time I would be in a pretty sorry position because of the battle was lost, employment at Homestead, which was a very progressive mill before the aftermath of the strike. Conditions changed greatly. The lost strike resulted in workers losing their union, having at-will employment. Most of the union leaders were blacklisted, and many of them were tried for murder, although none of them were ever convicted in Allegheny County. But conditions at the mill continued to deteriorate over the next 30 years, as many of us know. With some steps forward after tremendous struggles often developed over the next 30 years. However, it's not all gloom and doom, because progress happens, new ideas happen in both industry and culture, and we're I think honored to be able to hear Zach discuss that from the 1893 Chicago exhibition called the Columbian or something.
Yeah, Columbian
yes.
Exposition.
Okay, you'll explain that, I think.
Yes, I will.
And welcome, Zach. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me tonight. Thank you for coming. It's so great to see so many familiar faces here this evening. So tonight we're going to look at two different parts of my book and talk about some of the stories that we can find there. The first part, we're going to look at how Pittsburgh contributed to the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, through exhibits, but also as visitors. How are they experiencing the fair? What are they learning there? Then we're going to kind of turn it around, and we're going to take a look at how the Columbian Exposition actually influenced the development of Pittsburgh at the turn of the century, when we have Western Pennsylvanians trying to turn the Steel City into their own version of the White City. So kind of some background information on World's Fairs. These are the premier tourist attractions in the Victorian period. And their intent is really to promote international trade. And so the developments of rail travel and ocean travel truly make these global events. The first sort of modern recognized World's Fair is in 1851 in London. It's known as the Crystal Palace Exposition. It's in Hyde Park. They call it the Crystal Palace because the large glass exhibition hall that held all the displays there. That was Prince Albert's sort of brainchild to promote trade with the United Kingdom. And interestingly enough, right after that fair closes, a young Pittsburgh woman and her family by the name of Mary Shenley moves in right across the street from the Crystal Palace in 1852. So we already have that nice Pittsburgh connection with our World's Fairs. The first sort of World's Fair here in the United States is in Philadelphia in 1876, the Centennial Exposition. That one is meant to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But then it sort of evolves into this almost like a reassurance that America has recovered from the Civil War and that Reconstruction is over and America is a viable trade partner again. The next then World's Fair of significance is in 1889 in Paris. It's called the Exposition Universelle. We all know this one because that's where the Eiffel Tower debuts. And as Americans visit Paris and the fair, they love to see, hundreds and thousands of people walking around the fairgrounds, and they realize a lot has changed in America since 1876 when we had everybody here last time. And it's really time to invite the world back to the United States and show them how far they've come, that America is ready to become this global power. And so they look to the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's first voyage to the New World as being sort of a reason to celebrate and invite the world back to the United States for another World's Fair. That should be in 1892, not 1893, right? By the time they make a decision, they realize they don't have enough time to plan it for 1892, and so they have to kick it back 1 year. The Paris Fair, though, when they looked around, they realized it takes a lot of really skilled people to put on a really good World's Fair. France has an entire school called the École des Beaux-Arts that does nothing but train architects and artists to work on large projects just like this. And the United States doesn't have a school like that. If anything, we send our architects and our artists to the École to study in France. And so Congress decides that to overcome that obstacle, that they're going to hold the fair in Chicago. Chicago is just wrapping up their rebuilding efforts after the Great Fire there in 1871. And so there's this body of really knowledgeable, experienced architects there who have the experience of managing several large-scale projects all at the same time. And so what they do is they hire an architect in Chicago named Daniel Burnham, and he's put in charge of building the fair. Burnham assembles an all-star team of architects from across the country, and they gather in Chicago, and they decide on a few things. They decide that they're all going to construct their exhibit halls in the style, the neoclassical style that's taught at the École des Beaux-Arts in France, because it's a style they're already familiar with, and it's one that's already proven itself to be really good for exhibition space, because it has these large cavernous spaces inside. They also decide that all these buildings are going to encircle a central lagoon, which is what we see here. They decide that all their buildings are going to have the same cornice height, so if you're looking at it from the ground, they all appear roughly to be about the same height. And then later on, as time is not being their friend, they decide that they're going to paint all the buildings white as well. So this is why we call this court of honor at the Columbian Exposition the White City. Now, another benefit of having the fair in Chicago is that the majority of visitors would be coming from the Northeast or from Europe. And that meant that they would have to travel about a day by rail to get to Chicago. And so in a way, that day-long travel actually puts the country on display to them well before they even get to the fair. So you're going to pass through these industrial cities and see what's happening there, but you're also going to pass these huge expanses of farmland. And so they saw this as an opportunity to really put the United States on display. Pittsburghers are excited about this because the majority of those trains passing through to Chicago are going to come right through Western Pennsylvania. And so they think that folks who already know about all these great things that are happening here in Pittsburgh, they're going to want to come, they're going to stop, they're going to see how these things are being made. Maybe they'll invest money in here, in Pittsburgh industry, maybe they'll buy some products. And if they don't already know about Pittsburgh industry, surely once they get to Chicago and see all these great displays, they're going to want to stop here on the way back home again. Now, Pittsburgh, sort of unknowingly, has been preparing for this for a few decades, going back to the Civil War. In 1864, Pittsburgh and Allegheny co-host something called a sanitary fair to raise money for the Union Army. And this is sort of combines elements of your traditional sort of county fair, more agricultural based, but then also these elements of industrial fairs that are really starting to become popular thanks to the World's Fairs. Pittsburghers love it. Per capita, they donate more money than any other city in the country to the Union cause. And so this gets Pittsburgh excited about putting on their first full-on industrial fair. And they do that in 1875. They are one of the first, I think, dozen cities in the country to host their own industrial fair. Over the next then 2 decades, Pittsburghers are really becoming experienced in developing exhibits, not just locally at Pittsburgh expositions, but also at other World's Fairs and other regional fairs that are happening. At the same time, Pittsburgh industry is really starting to blossom. And so suddenly we have all these new companies that are invested in the success of exhibits. And we also have a lot of industrialists here in Pittsburgh who have the capital to put behind it to really put on a good show at these fairs. And of course, if we talk about wealthy industrialists from Pittsburgh, maybe the first name that comes to mind is Andrew Carnegie. Surprisingly, right? Carnegie is involved in one of maybe the first scandals associated with the Columbian Exposition. The World's Fair organizers saw the value in having something like the Eiffel Tower at a World's Fair to draw visitors in from all over the country, from all over the world. And so they realized that they needed to have sort of their own big attraction to draw visitors to Chicago. And so if you're going to do something like the Eiffel Tower, what's the next logical thing? You want somebody to just build a bigger tower for you, right? And so Daniel Burnham and his team start to see a lot of proposals coming in for large tower projects for the World's Fair. The most viable one is this one here by an engineer who designed railroad bridges by the name of George Morrison. This one is called the Columbian Tower or the American Tower. I've seen it referred both ways. It would stand 1,180 feet. It would be the tallest structure in the world at that time. As you can imagine, though, a structure that size would take a lot of steel to produce. And if you need that much steel in the 1890s, you're going to come to Pittsburgh and you're probably going to talk to Andrew Carnegie or one of his companies. And so they reach out to the Keystone Bridge Company to see if they would provide the steel and then lend their expertise to actually construct this tower. Henry Clay Frick and the other directors of Keystone agree to this, and they sign a contract to build the tower. And as you can imagine, the newspapers are very excited to report about anything concerning the fair, especially its big attraction. And so when they get wind that Keystone Bridge is tied to the tower project, they publish articles. But in those articles, they keep referring to the tower as Carnegie's project or Carnegie's tower. And when he read that, Andrew Carnegie was furious for a couple of reasons. For one reason, he thought this was a terrible business idea. He didn't think people would actually pay money to go up to the top of this thing. I think as one newspaper put it, like, what is there to see from Chicago anyway? It's all flat. There's nothing to look at up there. Secondly, Carnegie felt that his name was intentionally leaked to the press by the company so that they could use his credibility to get other people to invest in the project so they would be able to pay to actually build this tower. And so Carnegie tells Frick that he needs to withdraw Keystone Bridge from the tower project. So he does so. He writes to Morrison and tells him it was totally unacceptable to use Carnegie's name in the press and that they could no longer move forward. Morrison responds and says, that's fine, but if you pull out, the entire world is going to know that a contract with Andrew Carnegie isn't worth a damn. And so it basically threatens to ruin Carnegie steel companies. While this discussion's happening, the company that is managing this tower undergoes some restructuring. They get a new president, and that president reaches directly out to Andrew Carnegie to appeal for them to stay involved. He says that, the folks that were running the show before, we got a lot of promises from people that they would spend money and pay for this tower, but we never actually collected any cash. And so if you could give us some cash and invest in this tower, we have promises from several other folks here in Chicago that they'll match your investment and we can build this and we'll all make a lot of money. And that was the final straw for Carnegie because he was absolutely right. They just wanted his name to be associated with the tower. And so Carnegie finally pulls his support from the tower. He pulls the company from the tower project. And in January of 1892, we don't hear about this tower anymore. It is never built at the Columbian Exposition. The fair is scheduled to open in May of 1893. It's now January 1892, and they still don't have their big attraction. And Daniel Burnham is getting worried. And he is at a meeting with engineers. They would discuss sort of problems happening at the fair pretty regularly. And at one meeting, he sort of like unloads on these people. He says it's totally unacceptable that we have not come up with a great idea for this fair. And he challenges them. He says it's not enough to just build something that's tall anymore. This has to be something that the world has never seen. And luckily for him, there's a Pittsburgh engineer there named George Washington Gale Ferris. And shortly after that meeting, he sketches out what becomes known as the first Ferris wheel. Ferris brings his proposal to Daniel Burnham and his committee. I think it's in March of 1892. And lays the idea out in front of them, and they say, no thanks, you can't build this. And they're worried because they just spent the last few months watching the steel skeleton of their buildings that they were putting up on the fairgrounds get blown over from the winds coming off of the lake. And so they thought that surely something this tall, this fragile, would topple, and they couldn't afford those kinds of delays. They couldn't, that kind of press, really. Undeterred, though, Ferris comes back to Pittsburgh, and he pours thousands of dollars of his own money to do more designs and blueprints. He has another engineer actually invent the math to determine the stresses that would be placed on the axle of the wheel, because something of this size has never been done before. And he returns to Chicago in June with all these calculations and all these drawings, presents it again, and this time the committee agrees for him to build his wheel. And then the next day they say, you know what, on second thought, no, you can't build the wheel here. The concern now is that something like this in the Midway Plaisance that was meant to be an entertainment center, it's going to detract from the seriousness of the exhibits in the exhibit halls in the Court of Honor. So thank you, but no thank you. You can't build your wheel. Ferris, though, realizes they're running out of time and they're running out of options. And so he comes back to Pittsburgh again. He founds a company that would be responsible for not only building the wheel, but managing it while it's during the fair, and then tearing it down when the fair is over. And December of 1892 rolls around, and he goes back to Chicago again. So we're now less than 6 months from the time that the fair is scheduled to open. Presents the company, presents his plans one more time, and still reluctantly, they do agree to let Ferris build his wheel. But he actually had to post a bond that promised that that the wheel would be up, it would be operational, it wouldn't be a catastrophe. But now it's the middle of winter in Chicago, and they need to start construction right away. So they have to use dynamite to loosen the earth so they could pour the foundations for the structures that would hold up the wheel. Ferris gets back to Pittsburgh, and he was His company basically inspected steel at various steel companies. So he uses his contacts in the steel industry to basically farm out like individual pieces of steel to all these different companies, because no one company could actually produce all the steel fast enough for this to be viable. So he capitalizes on those connections, and then has his inspectors on site measuring everything, making sure everything is right the first time, so that when it gets shipped to Chicago, it can go all together like a puzzle without any problems. May 1st rolls around when the fair opens. The wheel is not complete, not surprisingly. So the parade goes right beneath it though. And so it's a nice teaser for what the Ferris wheel might have to offer. But it takes until the middle of June for the Ferris wheel to finally be operational and open to the public. At its completion, it stands higher than, more than 250 feet in height. It has 36 cars on it that are each about the size of a trolley. So at capacity, it holds 1,440 people. Each of those people pay 50 cents for a ticket to go on a 20-minute 2-revolution ride around the wheel. 50 cents is the same cost just to get into the Columbian Exposition. So that's how expensive this was for them. 1.5 million people pay for a ticket to ride on the Ferris wheel. That's compared to 1.9 million tickets that were sold for the Eiffel Tower. So that's pretty close, even though it opened a month and a half late. It did pretty good. But it's a total success. It becomes that iconic structure, that iconic image of the World's Fair. Some credit the opening of the Ferris wheel in June as saving the fair, because the attendance numbers were really low before the wheel actually opened. And Ferris and images of the wheel, all they were superstars during 1893. They appeared in books and tchotchkes and souvenirs, sheet music. There's sheet music with Ferris's image and the wheel on it. So it's successful thanks to Pittsburgh and his Pittsburgh connections. Now, in addition to building something better than the Eiffel Tower, the fair organizers also promised that the Columbian Exposition would be the largest display of electric light that the world had ever seen at that time. They made that promise right in the middle of the War of the Currents, between Thomas Edison and his direct current electricity, and George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla and his alternating current electrical system. These two sides have been going through a PR battle for a few years now. That battle got so vicious that at one point Thomas Edison actually invents the electric chair using Westinghouse parts and alternating current electricity to prove how deadly Westinghouse's currents were. He actually advocated for the act of being electrocuted by the chair to be called being Westinghouse, but it never caught on. But as you can imagine, a PR battle like that costs a lot of money. And so when a recession hits in 1889, both sides are in danger of losing control of their company. Westinghouse is able to do some maneuvers and keep control of Westinghouse Electric. But Edison actually loses control of his company and his patents in a merger that forms General Electric. So in April of 1892, when the Exposition puts out a call for proposals to electrify the fair, Westinghouse and General Electric are really the only two companies around that have the capacity to do what they need to do in Chicago. GE puts in a bid for an all-direct current system. Westinghouse puts in a bid for an all-alternating current system that is $1 million cheaper. We might think certainly the fair that's cash-strapped, they're running out of time, certainly they will go with the lower bid so they can save some money. But there's a few things working against Westinghouse here. For one thing, some of the folks that are on this committee actually have an interest in General Electric. And so it would behoove them to pick GE's bid because they would financially gain from that. GE also holds all of Edison's patents for the most commonly used electrical equipment at the time, including the light bulb that everybody's using. And so there was some concern that Westinghouse actually didn't have the right to build what he was proposing. He couldn't legally use these things. But despite of all that, the committee does decide to go with Westinghouse, but they make him post $1 million bond promising that on May 1st, when the fair opens, everything's going to light up, everything's going to work. So if he fails here, Westinghouse is essentially ruined. His companies are no more. So Westinghouse rushes back to Pittsburgh. He has his engineers design the largest dynamos the world had ever seen. He not only invents a new kind of light bulb, but then invents the machinery that will produce them in bulk so he can have them all produced and get to Chicago and installed in time. But on May 1st, when President Cleveland stands in front of hundreds of thousands of people, he pushes a gold button, everything lights up, everything works. So how is Westinghouse able to do this for $1 million cheaper than GE? He essentially builds this at cost because he realizes that if he's successful here in Chicago, where they expect millions of visitors to come, not only is it going to show that his company is successful, it's also going to show that alternating current is safe and successful and really the preferred method of electrification moving forward. He was so transparent about how safe this electricity was that he actually put the control panel for the fair's electrical system on display and made sure that it was only staffed by one man, so you could see how simple it was, how easy it was, how safe it was. Westinghouse also then has his own exhibit in the electrical hall, which is what we see here in the front and then kind of behind it. GE gets somehow put right in the middle of all that. I'm not sure how that happened. But he has a miniature display of an alternating current system, so people could actually come and see and sort of understand how this electricity is not only being produced, but then how it's transmitted safely. He's also showing sort of like the potential of what you can do with electricity. If we look in the back here, he's actually created a mural of Christopher Columbus using his electricity and his Westinghouse light bulbs. But he's successful. Once again, we see Pittsburgh coming up with one of the defining features of the Columbian Exposition. So I mentioned earlier that Pittsburghers were excited for a Chicago fair because it meant that a lot of the visitors are going to pass through Western Pennsylvania. But that also meant that a lot of the exhibits were going to also have to pass through Pittsburgh on their way to Chicago. And in April of 1893, we see a few really big exhibits come through town. The first is the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell actually spends a night downtown near the point. There's a huge celebration. There are fireworks because it's Pittsburgh, even though it's raining, and folks are able to go downtown and take a look at the Liberty Bell. They can't touch it, but they are allowed to get pretty close to it. As the bell's sitting in Pittsburgh, there's another huge exhibit making its way across the Atlantic Ocean. The Krupp Gun Company in Essen, Germany, has decided to send over the largest cannon in the world for display in Chicago. And so it arrives in Baltimore, and it takes a few days, but they figure out how to get this thing out of the ship because that was a real problem for them. And they place it on these specialty railroad cars that were designed by the Pennsylvania Railroad in Altoona, which we see here. And it slowly makes its way across the country. And so this enormous cannon spends a night downtown in the Strip District in the rail yards there. And Pittsburghers are able to come in and take a look at it. Eventually people get bored with that and they decide they want to climb on it. And then somebody finds some chalk and they decide they're going to write their name on the cannon. So we left our mark on the cannon. But what this does is all throughout April, this month leading up to the fair, Pittsburghers are really getting excited about what's going on in Chicago, the potential of what they could see in Chicago by all these great things that are passing through town. It also means that working class folks who couldn't afford that trip to Chicago, they also get to experience some of these exhibits. They get to feel like they're part of this huge global event. So how do exhibits from Pittsburgh make their way to Chicago? There's a few different ways for that. The state of Pennsylvania had a board of World's Fair managers that was comprised of your usual sort of rich, wealthy white guys who their job was basically to just get everybody in Pennsylvania who had something to put on display at the fair to give them something that they could put in the state's exhibits in each of the buildings. Here in Pittsburgh, the Chamber of Commerce also had their own World's Fair committee, and they were trying to get all the Pittsburgh companies and all the Pittsburghers who had things to display to send their materials to Chicago. And in May of 1892, they held this huge banquet at the Duquesne Club, and it's basically a pep rally to get people excited for the World's Fair. And it's there that Mayor Henry Gurley really kind of lays out the potential for what the Columbian Exposition could mean to Pittsburgh. He basically says, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, the only reason Chicago has the fair is because people from Chicago won't stop talking about how great it is. And we don't do that here in Pittsburgh. But Chicago at the Columbian Exposition is where we're going to start. This is where we're going to show the world all the great things that are happening here in Pittsburgh. We're going to make them recognize what's happening here. And he makes this statement in a room full of people who have the money, who have the connections to make that happen. So who's exhibiting at the World's Fair? Henry Clay Frick is one of those people who was at the banquet, and he is put in charge of the Carnegie Steel display for the Columbian Exposition. He hires an interior designer to come up with the plan, approves that plan, and then sends it to Andrew Carnegie for his approval. Carnegie hated it. He said it was pretentious. His exact phrase was, "It's too Frenchy." I don't know what he meant by that, but he definitely didn't like this thing. And he closes his letter by essentially saying, I would rather not exhibit at all than use this exhibit design at the Columbian Exposition. And so there is no Carnegie Steel display at the World's Fair. I think this hit Henry Clay Frick a little bit more personally than the tower fiasco for a couple different reasons. One, Frick is an art guy, so Carnegie poo-pooing his interior designer's design is sort of like a knock on his integrity as like an art critic. Secondly, they're having this conversation in November of 1892. The steel strike here is just kind of wrapping up. That's a strike that saw Carnegie claim he had no idea what Frick was doing here and refused to take any responsibility. It's a strike that saw Frick shot and stabbed in an assassination attempt. So there was definitely some ill will building between those two. And now we have another instance where Carnegie is probably overstepping his role here, and he's second-guessing Frick's decision and actually making him back out of a decision that he made. So Frick, reluctantly, writes to his colleagues at Carnegie Steel, and he says, you know what, I never thought that exhibiting at the World's Fair was actually going to be worth our time, but I had to wait for Carnegie to say so before we pulled the plug on this venture. We know this isn't true because he spends thousands of dollars on the Frick Coke Company exhibit. He has more control over that exhibit, over that company, and so what we get is this right here. This is a model replica of a coke town, a coal town out near Connellsville. It has working railroad and mine cars. There's beehive coke ovens that are lit underneath with gas jets. There's worker housing. It's all very engaging. It's all very interesting, but it's also not like too much to give away trade secrets. He knew sort of just where to stop before giving away anything really, really important. But folks love this. It won awards at the fair. A lot of trade journals in the coal industry talked about how great this exhibit was, how detailed it was. It was so beloved that they brought it back to Pittsburgh, and in 1894 it went on display at the Western Pennsylvania Exposition down at the Point, and that's actually where that photograph was taken. Another company from Pittsburgh that displayed at the Columbian Exposition was the Heinz Company. We see here at the center of their exhibit was a pyramid made out of glass jars containing Heinz products. And then at the corner of each corner of the exhibit was a pagoda that was staffed by a woman that spoke 4 languages. So just about any visitor at the fair, at that exhibit, could be greeted in their own tongue. When Heinz came to visit his exhibit, though, it looked pretty much like it does here. And it's missing one important thing. There was no people. Nobody was coming to the Heinz exhibit. And that's because this was on the 2nd floor of the agricultural building. And the last thing that visitors want to do after walking around the fairgrounds all day looking at exhibits is to climb a bunch of stairs to go look at more stuff. So nobody was coming to see the Heinz exhibit. So Heinz had an idea. He printed off these coupons and had boys distribute them throughout the fairgrounds. The coupon said, if you bring this back to the Heinz exhibit on the 2nd floor of the agricultural building, redeem it, we will give you a free souvenir. Who doesn't love free stuff? So suddenly, thousands of people every day are climbing those stairs to the Heinz booth so they could come, they get free samples, make a lunch out of it at a very expensive fair, and there's correspondence that says so. This is people's free lunch. And they're redeeming that coupon to get their souvenir, which was a small pickle charm that they could put on their watch chain. So this is sort of the, not the original pickle pin, because they were giving it out before the Columbian Exposition, but this is where it really takes off. They give away 1 million pickle pins at the fair. It becomes so popular that the Columbian Exposition actually has to post guards to control the crowds. When they tear this exhibit down, the floor beneath it is actually sagging from the weight of the people that were there every day. Super successful, so much so that the other American vendors on that floor loved Heinz because that meant people were coming to their booths too. And at the end of the fair, they actually held a banquet in his honor and gave him a trophy, thanking him for his idea to get people up to the second floor. We see some other smaller or newer companies also exhibiting at the fair from Pittsburgh. So the Pittsburgh Reduction Company, which we know as Alcoa, was just starting out. They were the only mass producer of aluminum to exhibit at the fair. And their process was so unique that their exhibits not only were part of the metallurgical classification system, but also the electrical classification system because they were using electricity to produce the aluminum. We also see a lot of area farmers and craftsmen have things on display as well. I didn't realize leather working was a really big thing in Allegheny City until I started reading through the exhibits. A lot of leather workers in Allegheny City. But Pittsburghers also took the opportunity to show off more than just products at the fair. They also tried to show that they were engaged in science. Certainly Westinghouse was a big part of science here in Western Pennsylvania, but we also have John Bashir had a display of his telescopes at the exposition. We also have a lot of local schools have their student work on display, both public schools and parochial schools. And the Western University of Pennsylvania also had a display. It was one of 4 universities from Pennsylvania with an exhibit. They had displays of student and faculty work, photographs of their buildings and equipment, and also photographs of some of their famous alumni. And then after the fair was over, they took the opportunity to buy up electrical equipment and mineral samples on the cheap for people who didn't want to drag that stuff back home, and outfitted an entire electrical engineering lab at the university based on what they purchased at the fair. But the most consequential thing about the Western University exhibit was actually its location. It was right around the corner from the University of Pennsylvania's exhibit. And they realized that people started confusing Western University as being some kind of branch campus of Penn. And so in 1907, when Western University is debating changing its name to the University of Pittsburgh, they think back to their experience here at the World's Fair, realized how confusing it was, and that is one of the reasons why we have the University of Pittsburgh today. So I've talked a bit about the exhibits that are on display in the Court of Honor. I mentioned that the Midway Plaisance is where the Ferris wheel is located. There's also a third arm of the Columbian Exposition that really doesn't get talked about a whole lot. It's called the World's Congress Auxiliary. It's sort of this organizational body that organizes conferences that met for the entire duration of the Columbian Exposition. And these were on all kinds of scientific and social topics. And we see a lot of Pittsburghers participate either in organizing some of these conferences or actually giving speeches at some of these conferences. For example, there's a local journalist named Kara Reese who gives a speech at the women's conference. She talks about the importance of working women and homemakers really supporting each other as a way to advance the cause of women, all women. There's a lot of Pittsburghers involved in the Conference on Temperance. One local clergyman gives a speech talking about the impact that Sunday drinking has on his parishioners. And basically, he says, a lot of people depend on production to make their money. You get paid by how much you produce. And if somebody on your team, maybe in the steel mill, is drinking all day on Sunday, when they come in on Monday, not that they're not being safe, but they're not working to their full potential. And so you're not producing as much steel, therefore they're costing you money. So it's not about it being healthy or immoral, it's about they're costing you money at the end of the day. Another Pittsburgher, actually somebody from Allegheny City, Pauline Rosenberg, gives a talk at the Jewish Women's Conference about how the founding of America was sort of this opportunity for the Jewish people to sort of have a second chance. And then she goes on at the end of that conference to co-found what becomes the National Council of Jewish Women. The Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce is at the fair, and they're handing out this book called Guide to All Points of Interest in and About Pittsburgh. And we might expect this to talk about steel mills and factories and what's being produced here. What it's really talking about are going on river excursions, riding up the incline to take in the great views, all those things that we might do with family members who've never been here before. They are promoting Pittsburgh as a tourist attraction in 1893, and it sounds remarkably similar to what we might expect to see today. There's a few Pittsburgh artists that also had their works on display at the fair. So the usual suspects like George Hessel, Thomas Shields Clark, Joseph Woodwell all had works on display in the Fine Arts Building. The most famous Pittsburgh artist, though, was Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was born in Allegheny City and trained in Philadelphia before she moved to Paris, where she became an influential member of the Impressionist movement. And Paris is where Bertha Palmer, the head of the Women's Committee, found Cassatt and asked her to paint a mural for the inside of the women's building that would be called Modern Women. Cassatt had never painted a mural before. Impressionists really didn't do public artwork. But despite her inexperience and the protests of some of her colleagues, she agreed to take the commission. And she made sure that she was being paid the same amount as her male mural painters at the fair. So good for her. What resulted is this mural here, and I apologize for the bad picture, and you're going to find out why in a minute. But her mural was surrounded by a bright gold border, and then she broke the painting down into 3 parts. This is supposed to represent women chasing fame. This is like women plucking the fruits of knowledge. And then this is women pursuing the arts. Because she broke this mural down into 3 pieces, though, it meant that the figures were smaller than life size. And so from 3 stories down, this was very hard painting to read. For the people who did bother to look at it, though, they really didn't like it too much for a few reasons. One reason was that she still used the bright colors of the Impressionist movement in the mural, and so it really clashed against the whites and the pastels that was surrounding it in the entire fairgrounds. It was kind of jarring to see this. Art critics also felt that Cassatt took advantage of the commission and painted modern women as she hoped they would be, and not as modern women actually were. And actually criticized her that, that she failed as a muralist because she herself was not feminine enough. They were kind of trying to hold her up to these ideal Victorian women that were being promoted throughout other fair exhibits and all these statues around. And their criticisms got really personal. And Cassatt decided that she would not make the trip to Chicago to see her mural on display. So she never actually got to see it in position. And a few years after the fair, this mural actually went missing. So nobody knows what happened to it. The last they heard, it was in storage with Bertha Palmer, but it's disappeared. So nobody knows where this is today. So thus the really bad picture, because this is like the only photo from 1893 that exists of it. Throughout 1893, though, going to Chicago to see the fair became priority number 1 for a lot of Americans, especially. This is no different here in Pittsburgh. A good example of this is the chancellor of the Western University, William Holland. His son is playing with a firecracker, and it goes off, and it actually singes his face. And when the chancellor writes to the boy's grandparents to tell them about the accident, he says, "Don't worry, we had a doctor look at him, he'll be fine. We got to get on a train tomorrow because we're going to Chicago to the fair." So they kind of like brushed off this like serious event because they had to go to Chicago, ironically enough, to see the 4th of July fireworks display. For a lot of folks in the middle class here in Pittsburgh, that middle class is really starting to balloon thanks to the growth of the steel industry, rail industry, and some other things here. So we have a lot of newcomers to the middle class, and so they're looking for ways to kind of assert themselves. And so one thing that they can do is go to the fair. They can buy the nice clothes, they can go to Chicago, they can experience the fair, and then they can come home and talk about their experiences. Maybe they bought some souvenirs they could display in their home. It's a way to kind of show that they can afford such a lavish trip to Chicago to experience the fair. For those who were savvy enough, they would go to the Pennsylvania State Building, because in the building there was a ledger where you could sign your name and your hometown. And every night a Pittsburgh reporter would go in and he would transcribe all the local names, and then they would be printed in the newspaper a few days later. So for those smart enough to go to the Pennsylvania building and sign up, they could eventually point to the newspaper with their name in it and say, see, I was there. Were you there? I don't know. Because of these lists in the newspapers, though, we know that at least 10,000 Pittsburgh families made that journey to Chicago to experience the fair. And that's probably a conservative estimate based on gaps in the newspapers and just illegibility. I was interested in hearing a bit more, though, about that personal experience. What was it like to actually be in Chicago and experience the fair and experience these things? We're really lucky at Pitt because one of our collections actually has such a set of letters. These are letters from a young woman named Margaret Mitchell, and the first letter is actually from her mother to her while she's in Chicago to see the dedication ceremonies in October of 1892. And her mom remarks that she was surprised at how short the parade was. It was only 3 hours long, but that it was because, like just before the parade started, 10,000 workmen dropped out of the parade because Pennsylvania's governor was there in October of 1892. Why might they have dropped out? Strike, right? So she doesn't come out and say it, but it's got to be because of what happened here in Homestead. But she does remark that the country would probably be a better place if they would all just leave. Margaret visits the fair in June of 1893 and provides some great insight and details about her trip. So she tells us what hotel she stays at, what gate she enters the fairgrounds in. She tells us the state of the fairgrounds in June. Surprise, they're still not ready. They're still working on it. She gives us her first impressions. She calls it a peep into paradise. She thought this was the greatest place she'd ever seen. She also shows an awareness of exhibits that are from Pittsburgh. So she remarks that the Ferris wheel is the largest thing in the fairgrounds and that it's made by a Pittsburgher. Unfortunately for her, she's there about a week before the wheel actually opens for riders, so she's not able to ride on the Ferris wheel. Mitchell also makes an interesting observation, though. She notes that for folks who can't afford to travel the world, going to Chicago, especially the Midway, where all these, they call them ethnic exhibits, where you can meet people from all these different countries and experience their cultures. So coming to Chicago was a much cheaper way to experience the world. We might dismiss this because she was not a well-traveled person, so this was maybe just her kind of like overreacting to these new experiences. But Andrew Carnegie and H.J. Hines, who did travel the world, both make similar observations. So this really must have been an impressive place where you could meet all these different people from all over the world and experience their cultures. When the fair opened in May of 1893, that is the same month that the financial panic of 1893 also starts. So suddenly there is a worry that people will not spend their good money to come to Chicago all that way, that day-long train ride to visit a fair for something so frivolous as a fair. And so Daniel Burnham hires an artist named Frank Millet to serve in a role called like the director of celebrations. Basically, come up with ways to convince people to come to Chicago and visit the fair. And Millet decides that they're going to have theme days throughout the course of the fair to try to get folks attached to those, affiliated with those themes to come and visit on those days. And so Chicago Day is, no surprise, the most well-attended day at the fair. Most states have their own days. Pennsylvania has a day at the fair. The problem with Pennsylvania Day, though, is that all the organizers and all the entertainment for Pennsylvania Day all come from Philadelphia. There is no Western Pennsylvania representation at Pennsylvania Day. And when Pittsburgh's mayor finds out about this, he is very upset, rightly so. And so he calls a special meeting not just of the Pittsburgh councils, but also the mayor and the council of Allegheny City. And they get together and they decide that if we're not going to be included in Pennsylvania Day, then a few days after that, we're going to have our own Western Pennsylvania Day, and we're going to celebrate all the great stuff that's happening here in Pittsburgh. Surprisingly, they do get permission from both the fair and the governor of Pennsylvania to have Western Pennsylvania Day, which the press called Twin City Day, the Twin Cities being Allegheny and Pittsburgh. They're able to secure entertainment, and so the only thing they need now is to be able to get people to Chicago for Western Pennsylvania Day. So they reach out to the ticketing agents for the railroads to try to get them to bring down the cost of rail tickets, but they won't budge. The council members are extremely frustrated by this because for years and years they have granted concessions and rights of ways to allow these rail companies to run pretty much wherever they wanted all throughout the cities. And so they felt that they were owed cheaper tickets to get people to Chicago. And after several weeks of back and forth, the mayor finally decides, you know what, if we can't get people there, then there's no point in having this. And they cancel Twin City Day. Now I know what you're thinking. I keep telling you about stuff that didn't happen. Why is that? And I apologize. But I think it gets exciting and then it's like anticlimactic. But we can learn things from these, right? So in the case of the tower and the Carnegie Steel exhibit, we learn a bit more about that dynamic, especially between Frick and Carnegie there. We kind of see that, you know, Homestead is definitely like maybe a deciding factor in the split of their relationship, but we see that it's been brewing for a while and there's other things going on. In the case of Twin City Day, I think there's a few things we can learn from this. One is that we see that Pittsburgh and Allegheny can come together when they have a common interest, even before Pittsburgh annexes Allegheny City in 1908. We learned that rivalry with Philadelphia extends beyond sports, right? This all happens because Philadelphia is overrepresented at Pennsylvania Day. And we also get a peek behind the curtain and see how the railroads and the city allegedly work together for a common interest, and maybe that was a little bit more one-sided in the railroad's benefit than they would like to admit. I promise that's the last thing that doesn't happen. But regardless of Twin City Day not happening, like I said, over 10,000 Western Pennsylvania families make that trip to Chicago. And when they get off the train there, they look around and it feels familiar. It is a dirty, smoky city, just like Pittsburgh. But then they go to the fairgrounds and they see that white city that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. And they think, this is great. Why can't we do, if Chicago can do this on a temporary basis, why can't Pittsburgh do this permanently? And so they look to Oakland as being the place where they can sort of build their own version of the white city. The timing here is perfect because in November of 1889, Mary Shenley, who owned pretty much the huge swath of land, like right in the middle of Oakland, donated 300 acres to make Shenley Park. Mary had owned that land since the 1820s, but she lived in London, and she wasn't hands-on in managing this space in particular. It was untouched. But now that she donated some of that land, they thought, well, maybe she'll be willing to sell, and we could actually build here and make it something. The guy that's really the driving force behind this is the director of public works named Edward Manning Bigelow. Bigelow was instrumental in acquiring the land from Shenley to create the park. And as the fair was beginning to wind down, he went there and was able to secure a bunch of the plants from the horticultural building and put them in Phipps Conservatory. So you could actually go to Phipps right after it opened and see a bunch of the plants that were on display in Chicago at the Columbian Exposition. Bigelow also brought in a sculptor from Italy named Giuseppe Moretti to add some artwork to both Shenley Park and Highland Park. So Moretti does the large entranceway at Highland Park, and then he comes to Oakland and he does the panther sculptures that are on the Panther Hollow Bridge. A little bit later, he also does the statue of Bigelow himself that stands in front of Phipps Conservatory too. There are two architects that we can thank really for that the look and feel of Oakland that we all know today. The first is Henry Hornbostel. Hornbostel visited Chicago's fair and then basically turned around and went right to France to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. So he got to see what he was going to learn in action, like the ideal way to do this style, and then go and learn how to do it. When he comes back to America, he wins his first commission here in Pittsburgh for the campus of the new Carnegie Technical Schools, which we'll see up here. Campuses are nice because you get multiple buildings, and so you get a chance to really implement the things that you've learned at school. You get a chance to have a much greater vision than just a singular building. He also wins the commission for Soldiers and Sailors here, and then he wins the commission as well for the new University of Pittsburgh campus in Oakland. That design was called the Acropolis Plan because it kind of resembled the ancient Athens Acropolis. We are kind of standing at the top of that plan, about where the chemistry building at Pitt is today, looking into Oakland. I think there was over 20 buildings, I think, as that plan. They built 4 of them before money got in the way. It wasn't looking exactly like his drawings, so they decided to go in a different direction. He also does Rodef Shalom Synagogue that's down the road from there. The other architect is Benno Johnson. And Johnson really kind of fills in all the empty spaces in Oakland, more or less. And so he actually adds a building to Hornbossel's Acropolis plan. We call it Eberly Hall today. It was Alumni Hall back then when he built it. He also does the Athletic Association, which is the white building here, and the Masonic Temple, which is currently Pitt's Alumni Hall. He also does the Mellon Institute and the Young Men's and Women's Hebrew Association, which is currently Pitt's Belfield Hall. What we have here, though, is a situation where there's a small group of architects, all kind of building in the same style, similar color palette. It's a lot like the scenario that we saw in Chicago for the World's Fair. And the result is pretty much the same. It's a neighborhood that is greater than the sum of its parts. One building I didn't mention on that last slide was the Carnegie Institute. And that's because when it was first built, it was being designed and it was being constructed at the same time as the fair. So it was very common to open a newspaper and have an article about the Columbian Exposition and an article about the building of this library all at the same time, side by side. So we don't see that neoclassical influence on the initial Carnegie Institute building that we saw in the others. It's more Romanesque, like the courthouse downtown. It has these large towers on it. But inside, when it opens in, I think it's 1897, that's where we see that influence from the Columbian Exposition. There's natural history and industrial exhibits, there's a music hall, there's an art gallery. It's basically a World's Fair in miniature, all under one roof. So Pittsburghers could do in a few hours what they spent days doing in Chicago for a fraction of the cost. In 1907, they put a huge addition on this building. They take out those big towers, they put a new entrance on the front of the music hall, they add the Hall of Architecture and the Hall of Sculpture next to it, and that's where we really start to see that neoclassical influence in the architecture here at the Carnegie Institute. It's not just the Court of Honor, though, that has influence here in Western Pennsylvania. The Midway Plaisance and the Ferris wheel also play a role. So while the fair is still going on at the Pittsburgh, the Western Pennsylvania Exposition, we start to see amusements, like rides kind of sneak in a little bit. And so then suddenly we have rides both at the Pittsburgh Expositions downtown and at all the local trolley parks, eventually including Kennywood. But because the Ferris wheel showed that people would just pay good money to have fun. They didn't have to learn anything, they just wanted a good experience. The park that probably most fully embraced the Columbian Exposition, though, was called Luna Park. This was located for just a few years in Oakland at the corner of Craig and Baum. And we see here there's a large neoclassically designed entranceway. That'll look familiar if you've been to Kennywood. The Lost Kennywood section is loosely based on Luna Park. We see all the buildings are located around a central water feature, just like the Court of Honor in Chicago, only this is a ride. You could go to Luna Park and experience new technologies like Edison's cineoscope. There's even a Japanese pavilion here, so you could experience some of those foreign cultures like you could in Chicago. This was only open, though, for 4 years. There was an incident where a lion escaped and killed a visitor, and so they never recovered from the PR nightmare. But this, for those 4 years, this was Oakland's Midway.
That was like a zoo, right?
It was not a zoo. It was just somebody, they often hosted shows, and one of the shows included a lion in a cage, and somehow the lion got out. Yeah. The Chicago Fairgrounds was always meant to be temporary. They looked like the buildings looked like they were made of stone. It was actually made of horsehair plaster. There is only one building today that's been converted to stone. It was the Fine Arts building at the Exposition. It is currently the Museum of Science and Industry. But in Pittsburgh, you can still visit many of the buildings that were influenced by the Court of Honor in Chicago. We also have several organizations that still owe their beginnings to the Columbian Exposition. So the 20th Century Club and the National Council of Jewish Women both were founded to continue the great work that was happening at the fair. And really by the start of the World War I, Pittsburgh had really fully adopted a lot of the lessons that they learned in Chicago to help further promote the image of the city that they wanted to show off in Chicago in the first place. Mainly that Pittsburgh was a center of culture and innovation. That's all I have for you. I do have a few copies of my book. I have 3 copies with me. But if you're interested, that QR code will also take you to the publisher's website where you can purchase either a hard copy or a paperback of the book as well. But thank you so much. You've been great. I'd like to... If there's any questions, I'll give it my best shot. Yeah.
Yeah, about Luna Park. It is said, I don't know if it's true, that there's a building that survives the corner of Center and Craig. There's a building with a conical tower. And I've been told, I don't know if it's true, that was once part of Luna Park.
I don't think it's original to the park, but don't quote me on it. I don't think it was, but I haven't seen a picture of Luna Park that shows that building. And because it was only up for 4 years, I don't think there was a lot of change from year to year in the structures. I know certainly some of the amusement rides changed from year to year, but I don't think a lot of the main buildings did. So I'm not sure if that's actually true.
But to know more about that, when will you come up with the answer?
We'll have to analyze a lot of photos, I think, but yeah.
Off the water.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, this was the first time I saw the phrase Twin Cities applied to Pittsburgh and Allegheny. Was that common at the time? Did people refer to Pittsburgh and Allegheny as the Twin Cities?
That is also the only time I've ever seen it called the Twin Cities. So it shocked me just as it is you because I had to do a double take to make sure they weren't talking about like Minneapolis. But yeah, that's the only time I've ever seen it referred to as the Twin Cities.
Was there a master plan for Oakland that they laid out and just there were pieces, or did it all just kind of come together as random?
Yeah, so the question was there a master plan for Oakland, or did it all just kind of come together piecemeal? Yes and yes. I think really there were 2 plans for Oakland. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. comes to Pittsburgh, I think around 1910. And he has a report where he is, I think it's called something about the main thoroughfares of Pittsburgh. It's really talking about traffic and moving people in and out of the city. And he proposes things like the Liberty Tubes, and he talks about making downtown a civic center. But Oakland is sort of like his backup to that, and says Oakland would also be a good place for a civic center. So he kind of plants the seed of this idea, all kind of based around the entrance, basically where Shenley Plaza is today. He kind of sees that as being like the focal point, and everything would be around it. He's got the idea, but it's not implemented that way. There's another guy named Frank Nicola who bought a lot of the property from the Shenley estate. He's the one that we can thank for Shenley Farms. He's the one that we can thank for the Hotel Shenley. It seems like he probably had like a huge master plan for Oakland, but it doesn't all come to fruition. So I think those 2 really had plans, but they never actually were implemented quite like they wanted to. So what results today is really a piecemeal building. Outside of like the Shenley Farms itself, the residential part, absolutely is what Nicola had in mind, and he had a hand in that. But I think the clubhouses, as we'll call them along 5th Avenue, I think was a bit more piecemeal.
You had mentioned that the Columbia Exposition kind of wanted to like match or even exceed stuff like the tower, this being critical. Was there anything that happened during this fair that later on, subsequent world fairs, all of them just wanted to match the Columbia Exposition?
Yeah, I think there's always this sense of, was there something at this Columbian Exposition that future fairs thought they had to beat, basically, or outdo? I think there's always that sense when you're coming up with a global event like this that you need to do one better. I think there's a Paris Fair in 1900, but I'm trying to remember now if that's still centered around the Eiffel Tower or not. So I think they kind of recycled that idea again. And I shouldn't laugh at it because the St. Louis Fair actually recycles the Ferris wheel. They tear this one down, they move it to St. Louis, and they put it on display there. Yeah, they use the exact same wheel. And then after that fair is over, the Ferris wheel is completely demolished and it's scrapped. And so there are, fun stories all across the Midwest of like a certain bridge being made from the steel that was used from the original Ferris wheel. I think they say that when one of the engines that actually turned the wheel made its way back to Western Pennsylvania and was used in one of the steel mills around here. That's the lore, anyway. So yeah, there's always this one-upsmanship that is happening, but after this, it tends to be more like amusement rides. So the next time the fair is in Chicago is 1933, and it's kind of like a big sky ride that they put in at that fair. And by then, the architecture is sort of piecemeal, just like we talked about in Oakland, where companies are now sponsoring buildings that they design in all kinds of wacky shapes that are supposed to represent their products, as opposed to having a big cohesive plan like we see in Chicago.
The New York World's Fair in 1964 was, again, that was just a showcase for different companies' products.
Yeah, and that's where Walt Disney gets a lot of his rides there and then brings them back to Disney World. So I think Small World was the ride that was there. There's also like Ford had a Disney ride as well. Yeah, Jerry, did you have one?
Yeah, just about point out there are 2,642 Ferris wheels without in the whole world. None in Pittsburgh.
So no Ferris wheels in Pittsburgh right now, even though there's over almost 3,000 of them in the world. The plan, I think, is to build one on the north side, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't some of those horsehair buildings catch fire?
Yeah, I think a year or two after the fair closed. So again, this is all happening during the panic of 1893, and as joblessness and homelessness really start to take hold in Chicago, we see a lot of homeless camps in the fairgrounds. And the story is that eventually a fire from one of the camps ignites much of the fairgrounds. Yeah.
We have a Ferris wheel at the water park over
Is there one there? I haven't been, so I'm not sure.
there.
At Sandcastle.
You have a Ferris wheel there? Oh, I'm thinking of the roller coaster.
Oh, yeah.
There's some traveling shows that
Yeah, I was thinking.
miniature Ferris wheels.
Yeah, absolutely. And not long after the Columbian Exposition, carnivals and fairs figure out a way to make smaller Ferris wheels that they can transport from place to place. It does catch on pretty quickly. Yeah. Somebody else had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, most of the buildings in Chicago, were they steel or were they stone?
It was so the Chicago the buildings in the Court of Honor had a steel frame. And then they used this horsehair plaster to look like stone. That's why part of the reason why they painted it white. There was no actual stone though, because it was designed to be temporary. There was no intention for it to be there forever. Ferris actually thought that he had permission to run his wheel for the end of the calendar year, and actually went to court over it because they made him shut it down in November, a few weeks after the fair closed. So he couldn't even get a couple months.
Did he profit from the Ferris wheel?
Yeah, he did. And then after he did profit from the Ferris wheel at the fair. And then he tried to run it again at a different location in Chicago, just kind of on its own, more towards the Loop at that point. But people weren't going just to ride the Ferris wheel. There's nothing else to bring them there. So that one kind of became a financial disaster for him. And then he dies tragically here in Pittsburgh, not long after the World's Fair. And somehow the St. Louis Fair ends up getting a hold of his wheel and giving it one last ride at their fair. Yeah.
As a kid growing up in Chicago in the 1950s, this Museum of Science and Industry was one of the favorite places to go in Chicago because it has so much hands-on thing. My question is, one of the favorite attractions there was a coal mine that was made. And I'm just wondering if there was possibly any connection with bricks, coke exists, which is kind of a
Yeah, that's a
This is years later, so
yeah, that's a good question. So is the current coal exhibit, that's like a coal mine exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, does it have any relation to Frick's exhibit? I'm gonna say probably not, but I don't quote me on that. People get inspiration from crazy places, so I wouldn't say a definite no, but I'd say probably not.
And is that permanent building similar to the one that it replaced?
Yeah, I believe so. I think it's on the same footprint. I'm pretty sure the design is more or less the same. They just at some point had to convert all that plaster to actual stone. Yeah. Any other questions?
One more.
Yeah.
Is there any place in Pittsburgh that is associated with Ferris? A workplace or a foundry or?
His home on the north side, I believe, has a historical marker.
Who's?
Ferris.
Ferris.
Yeah, George Ferris.
It does, because I know people who live there.
Okay, well, there you go. Maybe you can get a tour. But yeah, that's the only one I can think of. He didn't necessarily he wasn't producing things. So he was an engineer and an inspector. So his job was really inspecting pieces that were being produced. He had an office here in Pittsburgh, and he also had an office in Chicago in the Rookery building, very close to Daniel Burnham's office. So the two likely knew each other from their office proximity before he actually was hired for the Ferris wheel for the fair. So there's definitely a personal dynamic there that I wasn't able to ferret out, but I think they probably knew each other before.
could you quickly summarize the story about what Westinghouse did to the light bulbs in order to get around this?
Yeah, so what did Westinghouse do that was different with his light bulb so he wasn't infringing on Edison's patents? He had acquired Westinghouse had acquired a company years before and all of their patents. And there was, I'm trying to remember the details here about it has to do with how the light bulb is constructed, so how the stopper is affixed to the glass bulb. And then it also has to do with the type of filament he was using. So the filament, I think it glues in, so they glue the stopper in, and then the filament was of some kind of alloy that just didn't last as long as tungsten or whatever Edison was using at the time. When when General Electric found out that he had invented some new kind of light bulb, they planned to sue him for patent infringement here in Pittsburgh. And by chance, Westinghouse happened to be on a train in New York with a lawyer from GE. And this guy let it slip that they were going to court in Pittsburgh. And Westinghouse, gets off the train, sends a telegram to Pittsburgh to give them a heads up. And so when GE's lawyer walks into court downtown on Monday morning, the Westinghouse lawyer is already sitting there waiting for him with all these schematics and drawings to try to show that the Westinghouse light bulb did not, in fact, infringe on Edison's patent. So these weird kind of happenstance things that make history, in this case, rears its head with Westinghouse in the bulb.
I think George Ferris's house still exists.
Yeah, there's one.
Arch.
The Mexican War.
Arch. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Mhm. On Arch Street. It's in the Mexican War Streets area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's folklore, but in the 1890s, Carnegie took the pictures of the Park building at Smithfield and Fifth, where it was just a steel skeleton, and brought them over to Europe. And I'm wondering if it took them to this fair to show the Europeans that we could build a high-rise with steel.
Maybe. I mean, so Chicago was, the skyscraper capital of the world at that time. So really, if you wanted to learn about skyscrapers and see them in action, Chicago is the place to go. Carnegie starts building the Carnegie Building, which is Pittsburgh's first skyscraper, I believe in 1893 or 1894, so not long after. I think there definitely could be more exploration on just that impact to Pittsburgh and Pittsburghers of just being in Chicago and experiencing what's happening there and getting ideas, not necessarily from the fair, but just being in that city. What can we learn? I explore that a little bit in the book with skyscrapers and also with the rise of settlement houses here in Pittsburgh. So Hull House is sort of like the major settlement house that's in Chicago. And I think that Pittsburghers going and seeing that and talking to Jane Addams, I don't think it's a coincidence that by the end of 1893 we see the first settlement house here in Pittsburgh. Yeah, it's kind of it's a social welfare, house. Yeah, they help Americanize immigrants. They do like sanitary programs, and then it eventually becomes, we're mothering immigrants and lower class folks, and then they kind of turn it more towards the city and see how can we improve the city as well. The Kingsley Association opens in late 1893, and that's the first settlement house here in Pittsburgh, and it still exists today. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.